Badbird presents Seat of the Allfather. Written by J. Isaac. This is Episode 10, The Hunt. On Friday, the children were even more sluggish. Max drank frequently, hoping to stifle his hunger, but it only seemed to make it worse. Max and the others confined themselves primarily to the lounge area of the house. They had not seen Georgia and Sully in almost 24 hours. Rather, the two adults had remained in the upstairs bedroom. During this period, they had been generating waves of ambient noise that proved impossible for Max to ignore. The day drug into the afternoon. Finally, Max heard a door open upstairs. Quick footsteps padded down the steps, approaching the lounge entry. Georgia suddenly appeared in the threshold. She flashed an intense smile at the group, bringing her hands together.
Okay, everyone. Tonight is a very big night. Tonight, Max is going to become one of us. And then we will eat. I'm sure everyone is looking forward to that.
The other children sat up in their chairs attentively, their eyes suddenly growing bright. The youngest jumped off her chair and pretended to take a big bite out of the air, clapping her hands together afterwards. She giggled.
I'm hungry.
Georgia smiled with her teeth closed, and then spoke.
We all are, baby, but not for long. Come on now, let's get dressed. There is so much to be done.
The family quickly marshaled outside. Excitement was in the air. Max hovered at the back of the group. The sudden sound of the back door slamming caused heads to turn. Sully was striding purposefully across the lawn towards the group, pulling on a denim jacket. He looked at Max and pointed a finger at the house brusquely.
Max, you're not going to be a part of this prep. Get inside and wait for us to finish up.
A thrill channeled its way through Max's bosom. This might be his chance. He nodded at Sully and headed towards the house. The man watched him go, and then began speaking to his audience. Inside the house, Max waited by the window watching the group. Sully and Georgia were speaking excitedly, gesturing towards the forest. The other children were listening with rapt attention. Presently, Georgia set off across the lawn, and most of the others followed. A small group split off and headed towards the sheds on the corner of the lot, Sully and the oldest boys. They appeared to be laughing and joking with each other as they walked. They entered the largest of the outbuildings and closed the door behind them. Max sprung into action. First, he had to eat. He rushed into the kitchen and grabbed an apple, which he wolfed down hurriedly. Then, he opened the fridge and pulled out a package of sandwich meat. He had eaten about half of it before his stomach stopped complaining of the hunger and began to complain instead of overindulgence. He tossed the package into the fridge and closed the door. Then, he headed upstairs. Inside the bedroom, Max pulled on the warmest clothes he could find. Most of the items in the room had been provided for by Jesse, and they were a bit large. They would have to do. As Max pulled on the roomy hooded sweater, he glanced out the window. The sun was almost behind the trees, and it would be dark soon. The evening cold was just starting to settle in. Sully held a lit match to a pile of branches and twigs that had been mounded in the large fire pit. The flame crept slowly from the match into the interior of the mound. It moved cautiously from twig to twig before finally coalescing into a glowing nucleus within the branches. Within moments, The mound was a large crackling fire, illuminating the gloomy forest all around. The children waited silently around the man. Some of them were shivering, extending their hands to the warmth provided by the flame. Sully looked up at the children, and then stood. His eyes reflected the fire, and his lips pulled back into a smile.
Children, I have been looking forward to tonight ever since our last event. All the time that you've been with us, I have helped you, trained you to take in the Father. I know that the transformation has been painful, but there has been beauty too.
Sully extended a hand towards Esther, and he moved a loose strand of hair back behind her ear. She looked up at him with wide, glistening eyes. He continued.
Tonight is a special night, because you are going to show me Father. I don't want any of us to hold back. This is a special time for all of us. We will get to experience Him and each other at the same time. Also, Max, your new brother will get a chance to become one of us. I need you all to really bring him into this.
His tone deepened as his eyes roved from face to face across the group.
Don't fuck this up.
One of the goats stamped suddenly on the edge of the clearing. Its eyes were fixed on Sully. James had been driving for hours. The bleeding had finally stopped. He had found a cloth in the back of the truck and used his belt to cinch it tightly against the wound on his side. The pain had subsided somewhat, turning from a sharp, biting sensation into a dull, intrusive glow that could never be put completely out of mind. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon. He checked his watch. It was almost 5 o'clock. James figured he would be there soon, and his jaw tightened in anticipation. Max had found a duffel bag in one of the closets. He put some extra clothes in it, along with some items from the fridge. He was in the kitchen, just zipping it up when he heard the back door open. He quickly stuffed the bag into a bottom cupboard and turned to face the newcomer. It was Georgia. Her face was alight with excitement. She held out her hand to him and smiled.
Come on, baby. It's time.
Seeing her outstretched hand sent a shard of terror into Max's throat. He tried to stall.
Time? Time for what? Where is everybody?
Georgia's smile dissipated, but she continued to hold out her hand.
You'll see. The others are waiting for us, out in the trees.
Max was shivering with tension. He took her hand and followed her out the back door. They walked silently across the spacious lawn. With every step, Max grew more and more agitated. He could feel his hands shaking. His mouth felt as dry as parchment. He had to get out of there. He felt like he had floated out of his body and was watching someone else, some other poor creature being led into the woods, led like an animal, like one of the goats he had seen the other night. Suddenly, a thought struck him. It grabbed hold of his psyche and wouldn't let go. They were going to make him the goat this time. They were going to do something to him, something he couldn't come back from. He had to act. In a flash, Max wrenched free from George's hand. He bolted to the trees, intentionally steering away from the path to the clearing. Georgia stood and screamed. The piercing sound echoed off the trees and followed on Max's heels as he blasted through the brush on the edge of the lawn. The forest was dark in the waning light. He could barely see the ground in front of him, but he did not slow. He sprinted through the trees and bushes, tripping and bumping into every obstacle. Max knew this would be his only opportunity to get out, and that he couldn't afford to be caught. This was his only chance. Terror propelled him on into the night. Sully started at the sound of the scream. He jogged to the edge of the clearing near the path and peered through the waning light. George emerged suddenly from the dark, panting loudly. She motioned wordlessly with her hand as she tried to regain her breath.
The kid, Max, he got away from me.
Sully's eyes narrowed, and he grasped George's shoulders roughly.
Where the fuck did he go?
Her eyes began to well with tears, and she pointed weakly.
Into the woods. He just pulled away and ran.
Sully shoved her onto the ground and swore loudly. Then, suddenly, he composed himself. Turning to face the children, he clasped his hands together.
It looks like Max has decided he doesn't want to be a family with us.
His audience stared at him silently.
I think he hates us. In fact, I think he wants to destroy this family and hurt Father.
A gasp could be heard from the youngest child. The oldest clenched his fists. Sully beckoned Georgia, who was now picking herself up onto her feet. She pulled a small tin out of her pocket and approached the children, who opened their mouths at her approach. She opened the tin, and one by one, placed small white spheres under the tongues of each of the young people. Sully looked on, waiting until the last child had received their portion. He held up his hand and spoke with a low voice.
By his choices, Max will not become a seat for the Father. Rather, he will become his meal.
A low whistle escaped from the man's lips. At the sound, the children snapped upright, focusing on his face. One by one, they began to heave, their breath quickening to a panting chorus. They dropped to their knees and began to shake. The youngest clawed at the earth and screamed. Their heads began to sway to a silent rhythm. Georgia took her position next to Sully. She raised her hand and spoke in a hiss.
Hunt.
Max had slowed to a jog. The forest was now a black void, save for shards of moonlight that cut through the canopy and illuminated small windows of forest floor. His forehead bled, courtesy of a collision with a low-hanging elm branch. The terrain had begun to change. It had been an uphill climb for the last few minutes, but now the ground was beginning to level off. The brush was thinning the further he went, making movement easier. Suddenly, a sound made him stop. A long, trailing howl had abruptly cut into the night air. It was followed by a cacophony of shrieks and baying, like that of a pack of wild dogs. The sound was spread out in the trees. It was difficult to pinpoint. One thing Max was sure of: the sound seemed to be getting closer, moving up the hillside behind him. Then, the night grew silent. Max panted in the dark for a moment, listening. 100 yards behind Max, a branch suddenly cracked. On his right, a shape flitted through the columns of light cast by the moon. Max broke into a dead run. Behind him, he heard a sudden crashing and a sound of heavy breathing. A piercing shriek cracked the night air. It was followed by several other howls off in the distance, building in intensity like an echo. Max put on a fresh burst of speed, feeling as though his heart was going to burst. The ground suddenly began to drop. He was now at a dead sprint down a steep decline, dodging boulders and trees that were appearing suddenly out of the dark. Max heard something on his heels and felt the slight tug of a missed attempt at his clothing. Suddenly, the ground disappeared out from under him. Kicking and flailing, the boy flew over the edge of a craggy, 10-foot cliff edge, narrowly missing a jagged stump from a tree struck by lightning in years past. Max slammed into the dirt, his eyelids filling full of dust and debris, and his hands puncturing from a failed attempt to prevent the impact. Temporarily blinded, he scrambled to get to his feet and tried to regain his bearings. he suddenly heard a whiz and a soft, wet sound of impact to his right. As his eyes teared and cleaned out the dust, he beheld a horrifying sight. There, impaled upon the splintered tree, was Jesse. Moonlight reflected off the blood that was leaking down the charred bark and being absorbed into the dry forest floor. As the boy died, he faintly pawed at Max. Even in the dark of the night, Max could see the boy's pupils were unusually dilated. They were fixed on Max, fixed in an unblinking stare as the life ran out of him. The sound of scrambling on the hill above broke Max out of his trance. With one last look at the dead boy, he scrambled to resume his descent. The headlights from his truck illuminated the parked police SUV in the driveway. James felt a stab of uncertainty. He considered the possibility that Father had planted the journal as a distraction, to throw off the scent of anyone who might be investigating him. James wondered if this could really be the place Max had been for the last few weeks. The house was large and elegant, and the grounds were meticulously maintained. James sat in the car for a moment, considering his next move. Then, abruptly, he turned off the car and climbed out. His heart rate increased, and he closed his hands tightly in anticipation. James strode cautiously up the driveway towards the house, scanning the surrounding yard. Presently, his eyes picked out two figures standing near the tree line. They appeared to notice him at about the same time. They began to approach him. Even through the dark, James observed that the figures were a man and a woman. The man appeared to be tall and well-built, and the woman, slender.
Good evening. What can we do for you?
Sully smiled and raised his hand in greeting. The end of episode 10. This has been Seat of the Allfather. Join us next time for the exciting two-part finale event, releasing June 2nd.